She was 20 years old, and she had been thrown out on a Tuesday in March, which is neither the beginning nor the end of anything, but is somehow exactly the middle of everything. The kind of day that announces nothing, and is therefore the perfect day for a life to change, without warning, without ceremony, without the small consolation of weather that fits the occasion. She had a coat that was one size too large, because she had bought it at a thrift store for $4 when she was 17, and had not outgrown it so much as grown into the habit of it. A duffel bag she had packed in the time it took her stepfather's voice to reach the particular register she had learned over 4 years meant that the conversation was finished, and a $10 bill that had been living in the zippered inside pocket of the coat since November, put there against an emergency that she had not yet defined but had understood was coming in the approximate way that weather is understood before the clouds arrive. And with that $10, Josie Crane bought a mine office on 2 acres of scrub pine hillside outside a town called Garnett, Idaho, that the Boise County Land Office had been trying to transfer for 11 years without finding a single person who thought the building was worth the liability of owning it. The Garnett Mine Office, that was how the county file listed it, with the definitive article and the capitals, as if the building had a title rather than a description, had been built in 1901 to serve the Garnett Silver operation, a moderately successful mine that had run through 3 ownership changes and 2 boom and bust cycles before going dark in 1937 during the second bust, at which point the office building had been locked and the key left with the county assessor, and everyone involved had moved on in the way that people move on from things that are finished, which is to say without looking back, which is to say without seeing what was left behind. Everyone in Garnett said the building was a money pit, that the foundation had heaved in the freeze-thaw cycles of 11 Idaho winters since it was last occupied, and would cost more to repair than the building was worth. The county structural engineer had said this in writing in 2019, in a report that used the word substantially when it meant extensively, when it meant possibly irreparably, and which Josie read on the county website the evening before she went to the land office. She read it and went anyway. Because what no one in Garnett knew, not the structural engineer, not the 11 years of failed listings, not the county assessor who had been holding the key since 1937, was that inside the assay room at the back of the mine office building, behind a door that had been locked since the morning of October 14th, 1937, when the last mine manager had turned the key and pocketed it, and then apparently forgotten or decided not to return it, lay something that a woman named Viola Garnett, yes, named for the town, which had been named for her grandfather's mine, which was a piece of Idaho history that everyone in Garnett knew, and no one had connected to the locked assay room, had spent the last 12 years of her professional life building in the hours when the mine work was done and the office was quiet, and she had the room to herself. Something that would change Josie Crane's life entirely. And something that would mean, for the people who had said that Josie was not worth the trouble of keeping, that they had made an error the size of a mountain they had not thought to look inside. If this kind of story finds you tonight, a story about what is waiting for you in the place everyone else decided wasn't worth entering, we'd love it if you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. And in the comments, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We read every one. Josie Crane had grown up in a series of places, which is different from growing up in a place. Her mother, Dina, moved when things got difficult, which meant Josie had attended 6 schools in 9 years and had learned, as children who move often do, to make the portable parts of herself more reliable than the place-specific ones. She could read a room within 5 minutes. She could make herself useful before being asked. She had a memory for the kind of detail, a name, a preference mentioned once, the specific shape of a grievance, that people reveal without knowing they've revealed it, and which becomes, in the hands of someone who notices, a way of navigating. Dina had met Josie's stepfather, Ray Alton, when Josie was 16, and they had moved to Garnet for a construction job Ray had been offered by a cousin that turned out to be more seasonal than described. But by then, they were already in Garnet, and moving again had lost its appeal. Ray was not violent. He had very clear ideas about how a household should run, and communicated them with a persistence calibrated just below what anyone looking from outside would identify as the problem it was. Which meant almost no one looking from outside identified it. Which was the point. Josie had spent 4 years doing the calculation all people in such households eventually do, whether the cost of staying had exceeded the cost of leaving. In March, on a Tuesday, the calculation resolved. Ray told her to get out in the particular way that is meant to wound, and was not entirely unsuccessful, because the house on the edge of Garnet had been the longest she had lived anywhere, and even bad places develop a gravity. Her mother was at work. She packed the duffel bag in the time it took Ray's voice to finish, and drove the Civic, a 2003 she had bought with 2 summers' earnings, and maintained herself because things you could do yourself were things no one could take from you, to the gas station on the south side of Garnet, and sat in it until she could think. She had $93 in the bank, and 10 in the coat pocket, and the particular composure of someone who has been ready for something long enough that when it arrives it produces not panic, but a focused, grim calm. It was the gift shop owner, a woman named Bet Crane, no relation. It had always been a coincidence that people in Garnet found either amusing or significant, who told her about the mine office. Bet was 71 and had run the gift shop for 30 years and knew every piece of county surplus property the way she knew everything in Garnet, which was thoroughly and with opinion. She came out of the shop when she saw Josie's car in the gas station lot and knocked on the window and bought Josie a coffee from inside and sat in the passenger seat and said, in the direct way of women who have been watching a situation develop and have decided to stop watching, the county's had the old Garnet mine office on surplus for 11 years. They'll take $10. The building needs work. The land is yours if you want it. Josie asked what was wrong with it. Bet told her, foundation heave, partly, some roof damage on the west side. And the assay room in the back had been locked since 1937, and nobody had been able to open it, which was not structural, but which gave the building a quality that potential buyers found off-putting, she said. In the way of a woman who found other people's superstitions about locked rooms mildly exasperating. Josie asked what an assay room was. Bet told her, where they tested ore samples, determined the mineral content, the chemistry of the mountain, she said. You needed precision instruments, and someone who understood them, and a dedicated space for the work. The Garnet mine had been a silver operation, and the assay room had been its most technical space. Josie asked if the lock could be cut. Bet looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating an estimate upward. That's the question, she said. Nobody's asked it before. She went to the Boise County Land Office the next morning. The land officer was a man named Craig Stover, who had been in the office for 17 years and who handled the Garnet Mine office file with the slightly exhausted familiarity of a file he had opened and closed without resolution, too many times to count. He put it on the counter and went through the particulars without inflection. 2 acres, the office building, a small equipment shed behind it. The building, 1901 construction, timber frame with brick cladding on the front facade, 4 rooms on the ground floor, plus the assay room at the rear, access through the main office via a connecting passage. The foundation heave, real, but limited to the northwest corner, which had moved perhaps 3 inches. The structural report, the frame was intact. The brick was cosmetic, the foundation issue was addressable. The roof, the west side, had lost some shingles in an ice storm in 2021 and had been open to weather for 2 winters. The assay room, locked. Key not in the county's possession. Last inspection prior to listing had noted the locked door and had not opened it. The room's condition was therefore unknown. Craig said the county would take $10. Josie put the bill on the counter. It came out of the inside coat pocket, still folded into the small square she had been keeping it in since November, and Craig looked at it for a moment, the way people sometimes look at money that has clearly been kept carefully, with a small and barely visible respect for the keeping of it. He stamped the form. He told her about a local contractor named Hemi Torres who knew the building because Hemi had done the 2019 inspection and had opinions about what it would take and could be relied upon to give those opinions straight. He slid a key across the counter. The front door key, the one the county had held since 1937. The assay room key, he said, was not in their possession and never had been, which meant whoever had it had taken it when they left. Josie thanked him and walked out into the March cold with a deed and a key and a building on a scrub pine hillside that had been locked and listed and unloved for 11 years. She drove up to the mine office that afternoon in the Civic, up the county road and then the gravel track that climbed the hillside through the pines, and the building appeared at the end of the track in the flat March light, with the particular presence of structures that were built to mean something. The brick facade was still mostly sound. The front windows were intact. The proportions were those of a building that had been designed rather than thrown up, that had been meant to project a certain authority, and had, even after 86 years of vacancy, not entirely let it go. She unlocked the front door. Inside was the cold, specific smell of a building that has been shut for decades. Old wood and old paper, and the thin mineral edge of something she would later learn was residual chemical from the assay work, the faint signature of acids and solvents that had been used in the room at the back and had not entirely left. The main office was a large room with a timber ceiling and 2 windows facing south and the remnants of built-in shelving on the east and west walls, shelving that had been built to hold ledgers and that still held, on the east side, 3 of them. Thick and bound in cloth that had aged to a uniform dark. She noted them and moved on. 4 rooms opening off a central corridor, the passage to the assay room at the corridor's end. She walked the 4 rooms first, a room that had been a drafting space, with the remnant of a tilted work surface mounted to the wall. A room that had been record storage, the shelving empty. A room that had been, by the fittings, a small laboratory for preliminary work. And the room that opened directly onto the assay room passage, where a second door, the assay room door, stood in the corridor wall. Oak, heavy, with a mortise lock whose keyhole was large enough to see light through, which she did, crouching, confirming that the room on the other side had at least 1 intact window. She stood up and looked at the lock for a while. She went back to town and bought a bolt cutter, a pry bar, and a headlamp at the hardware store, spending $22 of the $93 in her account, which left her $71 in the change from the hardware purchase and the knowledge that what she was about to do was either going to matter or it wasn't, and either way she was going to know by the end of the day. The mortise lock did not yield to the bolt cutter. The hasp was internal, and the bolt cutter had nothing to grip. The pry bar, worked into the door frame at the lock point, produced movement but not release after 10 minutes. She stopped and thought about this. She looked at the lock and the door frame and the hinges, which were on the corridor side, which meant they were accessible. She went back to the hardware store and bought a hammer and a punch and a nail set, and she came back and drove the hinge pins out of both hinges, which took 20 minutes and a degree of patience with a punch that kept slipping, and when the second pin was out, She lifted the door off the hinge side and set it against the corridor wall and looked into the assay room. The room was approximately 16 by 20 feet, with a north-facing skylight that was intact and filled the space with the flat, even light that assay work required. A light that does not cast shadows and does not flatter and shows you exactly what is there. The fixtures were in place. The long assay bench along the east wall with its heat-resistant surface and its built-in scale housing. The fume hood on the north wall above a gas connection that had been shut off but not disconnected. The reagent shelving on the west wall still holding perhaps 40 labeled bottles of various sizes. Their contents long since evaporated or crystallized. Their labels still legible in the gray and white palette of old ink on old paper. There was a muffle furnace in the corner, the kind used to calcify ore samples at high temperature, still connected to a flue that went through the ceiling. There was a microscope on a side table, covered in a cloth that had once been canvas and had gone gray and stiff. The microscope underneath it, she would find when she lifted the cloth, in remarkable condition. The optics still clear, the mechanism still functional. And in the center of the room, on the assay bench, arranged with a deliberateness that could not be mistaken for anything except intention, were three things: a metal document case of the type designed for architectural drawings, cylindrical, sealed with a rubber gasket, a tin box with a clasp, and an envelope, propped against the document case, its paper yellowed, but its address legible, in a hand that was large and confident, and wrote in a way that suggested the person had something specific to say, and was going to say it. On the envelope, "For whoever is patient enough to get in here." She sat on the assay bench and opened the envelope. Viola Garnett had been born in 1878. The granddaughter of Emmett Garnett, who had founded the mine that bore the family name and had given his name to the town that grew up around it. She had been educated at a time when the education of women was an afterthought in most institutions and a deliberate practice in a few, and she had been sent to one of the few, a women's college in the East, she did not specify which, where she had studied chemistry and mineralogy with the specific seriousness of someone who understood that she was being given access to something that would not remain available to her forever, and was going to use every minute of the access. She had come back to Garnett in 1901 and had taken over the assay operation because no one better qualified was available, and because she was, as she wrote in the letter without false modesty, very good at it. She had run the Garnett Mine assay room for 36 years. She wrote about this work with a precision and an affection that occupied the same sentence, the way that true expertise and genuine love are sometimes the same thing. She wrote about silver ore and what it looks like, and how it behaves under heat and acid, about the difference between samples that look promising and samples that are, and about the specific pleasure of knowing the difference when other people cannot see it yet. She wrote that the assay room had been the best room in the world because it was a room where things were either true or false, and you could find out which. And she had always found the knowability of things to be one of the great reliefs of being alive. She had also been doing something else in the assay room, she wrote, in the years when the mine work was done and the office was quiet. She had been conducting her own research, not about silver. Silver she already knew. She had been studying what was in the mountain, specifically and comprehensively, the full mineralogy of the Garnett Formation, which was more complex than the silver operation had ever cared about. Because a silver operation cares about silver and the everything else is noise to be set aside. To Viola Garnett, it was not noise. It was the record of what the mountain was made of and how it had been made and when, and she had been building that record for 12 years. With the equipment she had, and the intelligence she had been given, and the patience of someone who understood that the most important work of a life is often the work that no one is assigned. The document case held the record. She described it in the letter. 47 detailed mineralogical analyses of samples taken at precise locations throughout the Garnet Formation. Each analysis, including the sample's location, mapped to a grid she had developed. The mineral composition by percentage, notes on structural features of the rock that indicated the conditions of its formation, and her interpretation of what the whole body of data said about the mountain's geological history. It was, she wrote, a complete geological characterization of a formation that had never been comprehensively characterized. Because the mine company had been interested in the silver and she had been interested in everything. She had also saved money. She wrote about this after the geology, in the brisk manner of someone for whom financial information is functional rather than personal. She had been paid a salary for 36 years by the mine company and had spent on very little. She lived in rooms she considered adequate and ate what was sufficient, and had no interest in things that required money to maintain, and had invested through the Idaho First Bank in Boise in instruments she trusted, primarily bonds and certificates, renewed on maturity, allowed to compound. She had not spent the money because she had not found a use for it that satisfied her, and she had found, in 1937, when the mine was closing and she understood that the assay room was going to be locked and forgotten, a use that satisfied her very much. She was going to leave it in the room. She was going to leave it for the person who came and was patient enough to get in. She hoped it was a woman. She wrote this not as a requirement, but as a hope, because she had spent 36 years being very good at something in a context that required ongoing effort on her part to be taken seriously. And she had found this tiring in a way that accumulated differently than other tiredness, and she hoped that things had changed enough by the time the room was opened that the hope was unnecessary, but she put it in writing anyway, in case it wasn't. She closed the letter by saying that the microscope on the side table was a Zeiss, purchased in 1923, and was a better instrument than anything she had been able to find to replace it in the 14 years she had owned it, and she hoped whoever found the room would take care of it. She said the skylight let in a good light. She said she was sorry she wouldn't be there to explain things. Josie sat in the assay room for a long time. She opened the tin box. The certificates of deposit were from the Idaho First Bank, series ranging from 1920 to 1936. All of them made out to bearer. All of them at maturity dates that had long since passed, which meant the question of their current value was a question for a bank rather than a calculation she could make with the information available. There was also currency, old bills, denominations from the 1930s, banded with a rubber band that had fossilized in place and crumbled when she touched it. She laid the bills out carefully and counted them, and they came to $4,200 in Depression-era currency that remained legal tender. The certificates she laid out and photographed with her phone, noting the face values. The total face value, before any interest accrual, was $88,000. She opened the document case. The 47 analyses came out in a roll, on drafting linen that had stayed flat and clean in the sealed case, each sheet dated and keyed to the grid that Viola had drawn on the final sheet. A hand-drawn map of the Garnet Formation, the sample locations marked and numbered. The grid lines ruled with a precision that was a pleasure to look at. She rolled them out on the assay bench and looked at the map and at the analyses and understood enough of what she was looking at to understand that she did not yet understand enough of it, and that the first thing she needed was someone who did. She knew one person who might know someone. That was Bet, who knew everyone. Bet, when Josie called her that evening, knew a geologist at Boise State who had studied historical Idaho mining districts as part of a research program on abandoned mine characterization, and who had, Bet said, been trying to get access to the Garnet mine documentation for 3 years. His name was Dr. Paul Whiting. and Bet gave Josie his number, and Josie called him at 8 in the evening on a Tuesday in March and described what was in the document case in enough specific detail that Dr. Whiting said, after a pause that had a quality she recognized as the pause of a person reconfiguring their understanding of something, that he would like to see it. As soon as possible, he said. She said Thursday. He said Thursday. The bank came first. Idaho First Bank in Boise had been absorbed into a regional institution in 1974, and the regional institution had been absorbed into a larger one in 1998. And the current institution had a records and legacy accounts department that Josie reached on a Wednesday morning and described the certificates to in enough detail that a woman named Teresa Barrow, who managed legacy account resolution, said she would need to call Josie back with what she found. Teresa called back in 2 hours. The certificates were valid instruments. The interest accrual, she said, on 63-year-old bearer certificates at the rates established by the original terms was not a simple calculation, but it was a real one. And she had run it. The face value of $88,000 had, over the intervening years, compounded to a figure that Teresa stated, with the careful flatness of someone who delivers financial information as information rather than drama. $214,000. Josie was sitting in her car in the parking lot of the Idaho First Successor Bank when Teresa said this. And she sat with it for a moment in the silence of the car with the March light coming through the windshield. She asked Teresa to repeat it. Teresa repeated it. She drove up to the mine office that evening and sat in the assay room with the Zeiss microscope and the document case and the letter in the flat, even skylight, and thought about Viola Garnett in this room in 1937, on the morning the mine closed, placing the document case and the tin box and the envelope on the assay bench, with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and is executing it with the same precision she brought to everything else. She thought about the locked door and the 11 years of listings and the county structural report and the $10 bill in the coat pocket since November, and she thought. She wanted someone patient enough to get in. She thought. I got in. Dr. Paul Whiting arrived on Thursday in a university truck and spent 4 hours in the assay room, moving between the document case and the wall map with the focused intensity of someone who had been looking for exactly this and had not entirely believed it would actually exist. At the end of the 4 hours he came and found Josie in the main office, where she had been reading the 3 ledgers from the east wall shelving, which were the mine's financial records for 1934 through 1937, and which were, separately, historically interesting. He said, "This is a complete geological characterization of the Garnet Formation. Not a preliminary survey, not a partial assessment. Complete." He sat down in the chair across the desk from Josie, the chair that whoever had run the mine office had once used, and looked at her. The formation has been studied since in fragments, by different operators who each had a specific interest. Nobody has had the whole picture. He paused. Viola Garnett had the whole picture. Josie thought about the letter. Things are either true or false, and you can find out which. What's the whole picture worth? She asked. He said that was a question with multiple answers depending on what you meant by worth. The scientific worth was substantial. A pre-disturbance characterization of a complex silver-bearing formation was the kind of baseline data that researchers and regulators and mining companies spent significant resources trying to reconstruct from indirect evidence. If the data held up to verification, which he was confident it would be published and cited and would alter what was known about the formation's history. The practical worth. There were 3 junior mining companies currently interested in historical silver districts in Boise County, and a complete geological characterization of a formation was not the same as an ore deposit. But it was the kind of document that changed conversations. She asked what he needed from her to proceed with verification. He said access to the room, the documents, and a co-authorship arrangement that respected Viola Garnett's contribution as primary. She said yes to all three, with one condition: Viola Garnett's name first on any publication. He said he would have insisted on it himself. The foundation she addressed in April, with Hemi Torres, who had known the building for 3 years and who approached the northwest corner with the cheerful practicality of a man who considers heaved foundations a normal part of the mountain landscape and prefers them to the alternatives. It was a week's work and a fair price, and the corner came back to level, and the building sat square on its 2 acres of scrub pine hillside the way it had intended to sit in 1901. The west roof she patched with Hemi's help over a weekend. The windows she cleaned herself, which revealed that the front facade glass was wavy period glass that had survived 86 years of Idaho winters intact. And she was not going to change a thing about it. She stayed in the building. There was no apartment in it, but the record storage room was large enough for a sleeping arrangement, and had the mine office's original cast iron stove, which was sound and which, once she had sourced a stovepipe elbow from the hardware store and connected it to the existing flue, heated the room to a degree that was adequate for March in Idaho if you had a good sleeping bag, which she did. She was practical about this the way she was practical about most things. The building needed someone in it, and she needed somewhere to be. And these two needs pointing in the same direction was the kind of coincidence she had learned to take as information. Bet came on the first Sunday of April with food and opinions, both of which Josie accepted. She walked the building and the room and stopped in the assay room doorway for a long time. She was in here all those years, Bet said. Every evening the mine work was done, Josie said. The ledgers show when the assay reports were submitted. She submitted the last one of the day at 4 most days. The office closed at 5. She had an hour. Bet looked at the Zeiss microscope on the side table. And nobody knew. Nobody asked what she did with the hour, Josie said. Or they assumed they knew. Bet was quiet for a moment. Her grandfather built this town, she said. And she mapped the mountain it sits on, Josie said. Neither of them got to see what it became. On the first Friday of every month, starting in May, Josie brought 2 things to the gift shop, whatever she had found interesting that week. A mineral sample, a page from the geological analysis, a detail from one of the ledgers, and a cup of coffee from the machine at the gas station. Because Bet's shop didn't have one, and Bet had given Josie a coffee and a car in a parking lot in March, and that was where this had started, and Josie did not forget where things started. Bet accepted both the coffee and the interesting thing every first Friday and asked one question about it, and Josie answered in full, and they talked until the first customer of the day arrived. Dr. Whiting's verification took 6 months. In November, he sent Josie a draft of the paper. Viola Garnett's name was first. The abstract described her as a mining assayer and independent geological researcher who had conducted the primary fieldwork. Josie read the abstract 3 times and thought about a woman who had had an hour each evening and had used it for 12 years for something no one had assigned her, because she was interested in what the mountain was made of, and she thought, that is the kind of thing a person does when they know what they are for. It was October when her mother called. Dina had heard about the mine office the way things travel in a small Idaho town, which is with the speed and thoroughness of water finding level, and she had heard about the assay room. She called on a weekday evening when Josie was in the assay room going over the verification notes Dr. Clement Whiting had sent back, and the phone lit up with the number Josie had memorized at 6 and had not called in 7 months. She answered. She answered because she had thought about what she would say when Dina called and had found that she had things to say and no interest in not saying them. Dina said she had heard things were going well. Josie said they were. Dina said she was glad. Josie said, I needed you to come get me in March, and you didn't. Dina was quiet. I'm not saying that to be cruel, Josie said. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you deserve the truth, and because I am not going to pretend it didn't happen. More quiet. Then Dina said, I know. 2 words, in the voice of someone who has been carrying a thing and is now setting it down, not gracefully but honestly. Okay, Josie said. And she meant it as okay, not forgiveness, not the erasure of what had happened, but the acknowledgement that they were both still here, and the conversation could continue from this point, which was further along than not having the conversation. Can I come see it? Dina said. Josie said yes. She said come on a first Friday, there would be coffee. She was 20 years old, and she had been thrown out on a Tuesday in March. That was where the story had started. In a parking lot, in a coat too large for her with a $10 bill in the inside pocket. But that was not what the story was. The story was about the hour that Viola Garnett had every evening when the mine work was done, and what she did with it, and about what happens when someone gives that hour fully to the thing they are most for, and about the room that waited 86 years for someone patient enough to take the door off its hinges rather than give up on the lock. The Zeiss microscope was on the side table where Viola had left it, covered in the cloth that had once been canvas. Josie had recovered it in new canvas, proper instrument cover, purchased from a scientific supply company, sized to fit. She uncovered it every morning and covered it every evening, because the covering and uncovering was a form of attention, and the instrument deserved the attention, and some things you learn about an object by taking care of it that you cannot learn any other way. She knew this. Viola had known it first. If this story stayed with you tonight, if it made you think of someone who did serious work in a small space that no one else saw, or a moment when what looked like a dead end turned out to be a door that hadn't been tried the right way, we'd love it if you'd subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And in the comments, tell us this. Has there been work you did quietly, in your own time, that turned out to be the most important thing you did? We'd love to hear your story. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.